All right.
All right. I kind of got off track there. We're going to talk. This is our last Zoom talk, number 9, I believe that this is the 9th one over the winter on the weather. And the last 2 focused on what's happening to the weather because of global warming and climate change. And today I guess I made the topic erratic weather because that's what we're beginning to think. It's not just, it's a little bit warmer. The weather is getting weird and crazy. So we're going to talk about that and why. Before we get started, last week, now how do I hold that up? Can they see that?
Yep.
We all know who Greta is, that amazing teenager. I think she was only 15, dropped out of school, got on a sailboat, sailed with the wind across the Atlantic to speak. I forget, was it to the UN?
I think so. Yeah.
All righty. And since then, she was just interviewed a few days ago on NPR. Her book has just come out. It's such a great read. This is the library's book. I started reading and I reached for my pen and I remembered Melanie saying, "Do not underline the library books." So I'm gonna have to buy my own book because it's just, if you're interested in understanding in clear, down-to-earth language that anybody can understand, even if you dropped out of high school in 10th grade. She's back in school, by the way, as she continues to go around the world talking to everybody, that's anybody. She writes some of the chapters and they're all short. You know how we have short attention span these days. So it can be 2 pages, 5, 6 pages, plus a whole bunch of scientists, many of them meteorologists, also from other areas, are writing on different topics. So knowing that I only had it for a week and I kind of wanted to read it all so I could add to my last talk, didn't happen. But I did look up the 2 pages on clouds. Now, earlier in our weather talks, we spent a whole session on clouds. So now I have learned, as often is the case, it's not all good or all bad. Clouds, sometimes, depending, can add to global warming, and sometimes they can deter it. It's very complicated, and scientists aren't exactly sure yet, but they're working on it. So that's the point where I wanted to start underlining and resisted. I'm going to buy my own book so I can underline it, keep it for future reference. And I don't do that often. I'm a firm believer in the library, our taxes, one book, probably 20 people can read it before it falls apart. Why wait, unless it's a special book, use the library. Or I'm not a computer person, but a lot of people read online now, right? Okay, that's number 1. I decided, as I often do, to start with a personal story. When you look at this whole immense problem that's been going on at least for 30 years in the public knowledge realm, scientists knew about it before that, but it wasn't until the late 80s that it began to hit the news. I think we respond with our heart and our head. And the head part of me, my intellect, my studies, my left brain, knows that the world's climate has never been stable for long. There was even a time, I think, about 3 billion years ago, give or take. Did you know that we once was covered with snow from head to toe?
Yeah.
And we actually called it Snowball Earth. This was way before the ice ages started. Something totally different. And scientists really don't know exactly what happened back then, but we were literally snow and ice everywhere. Okay, so obviously our climate's changed. And I know that. But then there's your heart. And I don't know. So many young people live with their nose in virtual reality and they don't experience the real world much anymore. But for us older folks, and especially my parents and grandparents going back several generations, we lived in the landscape. We lived outdoors much of our lives. We weren't couch potatoes. And whatever the landscape was that you were born into and grew up in became a part of your life the way your family does and your close friends. And when a family member dies, even if it's a great grandparent who's 100 years old and you know it's going to happen, it still leaves a hole. And I feel that way about landscape. And so I want to tell a tale. And while I'm doing that, at the last minute, I asked Melanie to find Wolf Pass at roughly 10,000 feet in the southern Rocky Mountains in southern Colorado on a 2-lane road. And for years, starting about 32 years ago, I started driving west every summer to visit my children out in San Diego. And when I first drove west, climbing out of the Great Plains, which seemed to go on forever. Once at a rest stop early in the morning, it was in March on spring break time, and I was there to use the facilities. And this car pulled in with 5 college students, and they kind of tumbled out of the car. And the one guy looked around and said, "Are we there yet?" And I said, "No, you got about 200 more miles to go." He said, "Oh." So anyway, the Great Plains forever. And then you see eventually the Rocky Mountains rising up. At this point, about 12,000 feet, maybe 14, closer to Denver. The Wolf Pass, I'm guessing, is about 100 miles south of Denver, maybe a little more. 2-lane road. And 32 years ago, it was wall to wall as you climbed from 6,000 feet to the 10, where the pass was, mainly spruce trees, a wall of dark evergreen trees. And this would be true from New Mexico to the south, all the way up through Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, into Alberta. A type of forest, pretty much the same, changing slightly as you went north, for 1,500 miles or more. So it was early in the morning, and I finally got to the top, and on the map, there was a rest stop and a little arrow that said waterfall about 200 feet off the road. And any lowlander at 10,000 feet, you're huffing and puffing with the oxygen. Anyway, I huffed and puffed up by myself to see the waterfall, came back to the car and was resting. And in those days, I had a black skirt with orange and turquoise flowers on it. And all of a sudden, I hear this noise. And I look down, and here by my thigh, by an orange flower, was a hummingbird, thinking, "What's this?" And I said, "Well, hello, who are you?" And it zoomed across the road and into the mountainside. So that to me is a wonderful memory. Now, 10 or so years later, I decided to come back on this same road going east. And as I neared the summit, there's a rest stop with a bathroom. I began to notice trees dying. At that point, maybe 20% of the forest. And there was a maintenance guy painting the trim on the bathroom. And I said to him, "Hey, what's going on with the trees?" And he kind of looked down at me from the top of the ladder and said, "It's those damn bark beetles." See, now back then, at least in the East, we hadn't heard much about bark beetles. But evidently, that was the beginning of this long, was it 26 years now, drought in the Southwest. And as any gardener knows, if you have a drought, it stresses the plants. Think if you could only have 2 glasses of coffee, soda, water, whatever in a day, you'd get pretty stressed after 2 or 3 days without enough water. Also, with global warming, climate change, the seasons were getting longer as they are here. Spring was coming earlier, fall was coming later. the bark beetles just loved it. Oh boy, we can have 2 batches of babies a year instead of 1, maybe even 3. So between the stress of the trees due to the drought and the increased number of bark beetles, they were devastating the forest of the Rocky Mountains. So that was, I'm not sure, 15 years or so ago. And then I asked Melanie, because I don't have the picture anymore, but I think it was in a National Geographic, and they were doing an article on the bark beetle and how it was spreading from the western forests. There are certain places like the cypress forest in southern Saskatchewan, I think, where there are pine trees, and they're jumping a couple of 100 miles of the plains. It's like immigrants going across the water in a boat, and they were working their way eastward. And I don't know what's happened, but the fear then was, once they reach the boreal forest in Canada, in Ontario, north of us, it's going to be wipeout. So anyway, there was a picture in the middle. You open the magazine up, and this is where your heart comes in. You know it's beginning to happen, but when you see it, it was the pass, Wolf Creek Pass, in the winter with snow everywhere, one of those aerial views, a couple of miles, and every single tree was dead. Now, what did you just find here? There were 2 images we picked out of a whole slew.
I just did this one.
Okay, she just did this one. All right. How many million trees did they say?
834 million in Colorado.
In Colorado. I would find, rather than that number, because you can start saying, well, if they're 40 feet apart, that's so many per acre, so many per square mile. I would rather they say the percentage of the whole forest. Is it 5%, 10%? Here, it's getting close to 100%. Now, with global warming, this forest, the foresters say, is not going to come back because the conditions have changed. Grasses are moving in, weedy brush is moving in, and eventually, maybe within 100 years, the whole Front Range for 1,500 miles is going to be a totally different ecosystem and biome. And therefore, all the plants, all the animals, the birds that relied on the spruce trees, they've lost their home. So, and that to me, my heart is very, very sad. If I lived in this environment, and I do know friends of my daughter live in an environment like this in California, I don't know what it'd be like. Maybe we losing all our sugar maple trees, or how my grandfather felt down in Louisiana when all the chestnuts began to die in the 30s and 40s. So it's sad as well as alarming. So anyway, I wanted to start with that. Now, I forget exactly what examples. She had a whole slew of images to find for me. I wanted to talk about, what did I want to talk about? Has Jordan signed in yet? Oh, Jordan, wake up. Well, we're going to talk about what's happening out in California. Do we have anything? What about Paradise? Remember, I think or anything about the fires?
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we start with that?
I think I have to go.
Oh, that's Salton Sea, right? Or is that the Caspian? Okay.
And this is an aerial view
Of what?
of the Paradise Fire.
Okay, was that 2 years ago now or 3?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, anyway, about 2 years ago, the Paradise, which was a small town in Northern California, is that right? Living in this mixed forest mountainous area, had a devastating fire that essentially burnt the whole town down to the ground. And as I recall, close to 90 people died in the fire, right? Trying to escape.
Yeah, that's
or whatever.
That's an aerial view of the town.
All right.
Afterward.
Okay. Now anybody that has studied forest fires might remember 100, 150 years ago, some of the worst were in Wisconsin and northern Minnesota. In those days, you didn't have the kind of volunteer fire departments or the regular paid ones like we do now. I remember one story from one of those Wisconsin fires. The father and his two sons, teenagers, he sent the wife and the children out, but they were determined to stay and save the house. You know how they saved their house? They formed a fireman's brigade from the basement under the house, where the wife had preserved all these jams and jellies and pickles and whatnot. And they simply took the jars and dumped them on the roof to keep the roof wet so the sparks couldn't set their cabin on fire. Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway, you have great stories when you read history. But now we in the East usually have enough rain not to have to worry about that. Or if we don't, we usually have great volunteer fire departments like we do here in Alfred that can put out a fire. But out west, where the towns are fewer and farther between, and some of these villages are built up in the mountains where there's only one or two roads out. So if you don't evacuate early, some of these people, you hate to think about it, they got stuck in their car and caught in the fire. So, and this is happening more and more as the climate gets warmer. And the West, Southwest in particular, has entered this almost 25-year drought. We won't go back to the 1200s when the 25-year drought drove the Anasazi out of the area. I think we talked about that earlier. Now, what happens as an aftermath? Do we have any more fires or floods images?
I think just
No, we're moving on to blizzards now. Okay, fires and floods. Anybody that's lived in a mountainous area realizes in heavy rains, the tree cover slows down the drops, and there's everything growing on the ground, usually underneath, that absorbs and slows down and soaks up. Once a fire sweeps through, all that protection is gone. So when you have heavy rains, you have not only floods, but mudslides, which can bury a house. And woe is you if you're sleeping in your bed when that happens. So that's happened off and on now in California. A few years ago, they had a very bad one. I forget where it was. It was more towards, I think, Los Angeles, but I'm not sure anymore. Let me think. So the fire season, as I recall, out in California, by the way, the environment there produces what is known as a chaparral type of quote forest. Trees that tend to grow no higher than 15 feet and are susceptible to being burnt every 10 years or so by fire that roars through, burns up all the brush. But as soon as Smokey Bear, forgot to ask you for a Smokey Bear, I'm going to say 100 years ago, I think it was more than that. I forget who came up with the idea of Smokey Bear. It might have been the Forest Service. All of a sudden, we started suppressing fires everywhere, even where that had been part of the Native American tradition to keep the grounds open and not to allow all that dead brush to build up. So now we're faced with poor management for 100 years and a longer fire season. It's starting a month or two earlier and going a month or two later into the winter. So now instead of maybe 4 months, they had to kind of watch for it. Now it's more like 8 months. I heard one exhaustive fire recently on the news say it's becoming a year-round thing. So it has totally changed the way people live in the West.
And the fires in Australia, those caused by similar things, like
Okay, the Australian forests are totally different than our forests. And the part of Australia that had those drastic fires, was it 3 winters ago, I think, which was summer for them, was in, think of Australia. Most of the population is on the East Coast. And down in so the southeast part of their country has a some very high trees that grow in the mountains along that ridge dividing line of mountains. And a lot of, I would say, similar to our chaparrals type stuff that grows in. Now I'm not exactly sure, but I think that part of Australia has what's called, well, like California, a rainy season and a dry season. And what happened there was the fires were so intense and so extensive that people actually had to drive or walk to the sea and stand in the ocean to keep from being burnt alive. So, and once again, drought. I'm thinking
Sure.
Triggered that. So, okay. Now our problems with all of it. Okay, the other problem with the drought in the West, you build your infrastructure on past knowledge, which means climate, not weather. So if in the past in California, they had plenty of snows up in, say, the Sierra Nevada, and those snows became the irrigation water for the dry summers, because in let's think Southern California, Los Angeles, San Diego, it would rain usually from November through February, November, December, January. 4 months? Yeah, that's the rainy season. The rest of the year is pretty dry. So if you're going to farm, which of course they did in the valleys, you had to somehow harness all that snow water. And it was great because I remember driving east with my eldest daughter years ago. And in July, we were up at the divide at 10,000 feet in the Sierras. There was still snow on the east side and on the north side of hollows, even in July. So, and then as that snow gradually melted, they built reservoirs and canals to divert it to Los Angeles and San Diego. Well, now, as you probably know, the snowpack isn't what it used to be, in spite of the 2 feet they're getting this week and the 2 feet they got it, what was it, Christmas or whatever. That's like you see a starving beggar on the street and he's just skin and bones. So maybe he's 6 feet tall and only weighs 90 pounds because he hasn't eaten for a year or two. And you feel sorry for him. So you say, come on into the McDonald's, I'll buy you a meal. Well, he could scarf down 4 meals. That's not going to do him any good in the long haul. And so they realize in California, no, the drought's not over, guys, even with all this snow this year. And last year, I guess they had a lot too. We have such a deficit. It's going to take years to catch up. But my point was, they built the dams and the canals based on climate, which is that average of the last 30 years. And you remember in 2020, we got rid of the 80s and then went from the last 30 years, and everything changed for us. So the weather has changed and it no longer matches the old climate. We now have a new normal. So all of a sudden, all this old infrastructure is not really helping us that much anymore. Which unfortunately means money, 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 money. All right. Now, the Great Salt Lake and the Caspian Sea, we have a couple of images of that, right?
This is the Salt Lake. So this is what it looked like in 1986.
Okay, and wait a second. I started driving. The first drive was in 1990. So this was 4 years before. Now, where is Interstate 80? This way?
Oh, right? I don't know. I didn't look.
Okay, well, which way is north? Probably that way, right?
Yes.
Okay, so Salt Lake City is over here to the right. And further to the right, running north and south are the Wasatch Mountains, which go up to 14,000 feet. And we all know the Mormons being persecuted for a variety of reasons went west. I'm going to round it off and say in the 1850s. And their scouts had found this Great Salt Lake and the huge basin that ran north and south on the west side of the Wasatch Mountains, and realized that with community hard work, they could irrigate the lands around the lake and create a farming community where they'd be safe to practice their religious beliefs. So when I went by, well, we won't go there. It's a great story about finding odd motels. But anyway, Interstate 80, I want to run it up and down. Okay, that's going, sort of west out of Salt Lake. towards the Nevada border, 100 miles away. And the lake was right there on the side of Interstate 80. You could have hopped, if you could have parked, you could have hopped out of your car, and 10 feet, you'd be in the shallow, salty water. And the reason I caught this, now what's this?
This is
the elevation
of
the water.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
This is
I'm thinking, so the valley itself must be about, I'm going to say 4,000 feet. For those of you who don't know, this basin has no outlet to the sea. All the rainwater that falls within the watershed. Once again, Google it, guys. I forget how many 100 miles north, south, east, west. It all drains eventually, mostly into the Great Salt Lake, like the Dead Sea. It has no outlet. So as let's say since the glacier left 10,000 years ago, rounded off again, the water pours in and eventually evaporates little by little. It gets saltier and saltier, right? Okay. I just heard on the news a week ago and I said, really? If something isn't done now, within 5 years, it'll all be gone, leaving behind what the Spanish called a playa, a salt flat. So some of you might say, well, so what? Let's look at the Caspian Sea, which is like a trip back in time, 20, 30 years, that foresees the future of the Great Salt Lake. Now, okay, geography, but
oh no, I'm sorry.
The Caspian Sea is in Eurasia, the western part, surrounded by those Stan countries that broke away from Russia 30 years ago. Well, we're still hunting for the Caspian Sea. It's it's even bigger than the Great Salt Lake, I'm pretty sure, or was. And next to it, further east, was the Azov Sea, I think. But once again, same thing as in Utah. As the population increased and the agricultural use sucked up more and more of the water from the drainage, rivers and streams, less and less was left to go into the Caspian Sea. Here we have a map. It shows where it is. It's near Turkey and Iraq and all those stands, Turkestan, Kyrgyzstan. They are gradually drying up. And now with the climate change, and this part of the world is also getting hotter and drier, it's drying up faster. So as we use more of the water for drinking and farming and industry, less and less is left to go into these interior basins. Now, the problem really is, besides the birds no longer have a place to land when they're flying. For us, it's from Alaska to South America. The Great Salt Lake is a huge flyway overstop. Forget about the birds. Even if we didn't farm and pollute with our pesticides and herbicides, fertilizers, this natural earth, the soil and the rocks, in some places have poisonous substances like arsenic, selenium, something like that. And they dissolve in the water. And when the water evaporates and there's nothing but a salt flat left, and the wind comes along, and anybody that's driven through Utah knows it's windy most of the time, all that dust kicks up. And in it is the arsenic and all those other poisons. So if you go back and I remember reading about the Caspian Sea maybe 15, 20 years ago, once again in the National Geographic, how the population, not only did they lose their fishing industry, and now they're losing their farming industry as well, but the dust is killing people off. They're getting asthma, they're getting lung cancer. It's no fun. And the prognosis is, if we don't do something to keep the Salt Lake from disappearing, the same thing is going to happen to Salt Lake City. And everybody will be wearing gas masks every time they go out. Now, I don't mean to be a gloom and doom. Cassandra, was it? Was it Cassandra the old? Yes. Cassandra was somebody's daughter back in the ancient Greek days. who somehow could foresee the future. And she kept trying to warn her father about what was going to happen. And nobody wanted to hear what Cassandra had to say because they didn't like the message. So anyway, take heed, you folks out there. Let me see. And by the way, I just heard yesterday, did we get the Salton Sea or not? No, I come in with these last minute requests and poor Melanie can't get them done quick enough. But the Salton Sea, which is in Southern California, and that, by the way, is a total fluke. I remember driving on Interstate 8. It's about almost 200 miles from San Diego, going east, coming home. And I love it out west on the sides of the highways, even the 2-lane roads. Every now and again, like in Kansas, every time you hit 1,000 feet difference in elevation, they'll mark it. So in eastern Kansas, I think you're like 2,000 feet above sea level or something. And then a couple of 100 miles, there's a little town, and next to it is this little sign that says 3,000 feet. Anyway, I'm driving on Interstate 8, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, what did that just say? That said minus 50 feet. What do you mean minus 50 feet? I'm below sea level? Yes, that hole where El Centro is on Interstate 8, Mexico's, if you're going east, Mexico's to the right, down south, you wind up in a depression. And I think, Google it, guys, it's at least 79 feet below sea level when you get to the low spot before you start climbing out. Well, about 100 years ago, the Colorado River flows just to the west of that dip. And they irrigated from it. And there was a bad storm one year, and the dike broke in one of the canals. And all of a sudden, the whole Colorado River went down the hill into the depression and filled up what became the Salton Sea, which is almost 100 miles long, I think, and probably 30 wide. And I forget how deep it is. Not that deep, maybe 40 feet. Wow, did it say? You didn't look it up?
I didn't.
No, that's okay. Same thing's happening there, though. More and more irrigation. The population hasn't grown that much, but still it has grown. And so the poor old rivers that are feeding it are being sucked dry before they get there. So once again, the Salton Sea is sinking in elevation and exposing shoreline and poisonous dust. So once again, what are you going to do about it? Probably the cheapest thing to do would be just to move and let it be. Like, sometimes you can't undo what you've done. All righty. I have used many times in the past that life here on the earth is a tapestry. Anybody that knows what tapestries are, they really, I think their heyday was probably in the 14, 15, 1600s. The reason being, all the well-to-do lived in those stone summer homes and palaces. And anybody that's ever lived in an uninsulated house, heating with a fireplace, knows how cold you feel sitting next to a stone wall, because heat flows from the hotter to the colder. So you're the furnace, and all your heat is flowing out to that stone wall. You hang a tapestry, and that cuts down the radiation of your heat to the wall. So anyway, but a tapestry, like knitting. Do you knit?
I crochet.
You crochet. I think it's the same thing. How long would it take you to crochet something like this? Would you say, depending on the size of the needles?
Like
5 hours, maybe?
Yeah.
That needles?
Yeah.
How long would it take you to unravel it?
Oh, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Same thing with a sweater. So
my cat on it. No, wait, done.
Oh, I don't like the design, or the color's wrong. I'm going to redo it. Yeah. Same thing with a tapestry. You pull one thread and the whole thing can unravel. And I think it's taken human beings, well, at least modern human beings. I have a feeling our ancient ancestors knew this very well. You start messing around with one part of the environment, and all of a sudden, all the things connected to that collapse as well. And I won't go into it, but what was her name? She came from Cornell, And she gave a wonderful talk about how after the Second World War, they had to bring cats to some islands in the Pacific. You remember that?
Yeah.
And it was hilarious. It was like who's that funny British actor that did some of those spoofy type stuff? I forget who he was.
Why did they bring the cats there?
Because there was a problem with was it the insects? They sprayed the DDT to kill the insects.
Yep.
And then something happened with the lizard population, and that exploded. And that was almost worse than the mosquitoes. So then somebody said we have to bring in some cats to control the
lizard.
The lizards.
Yeah.
It really is funny.
Mm-hmm.
And I shouldn't laugh because I think most scientists are really sincere in their work and they want to find the truth and they want to do better. It's just that sometimes finding the truth is not easy, you know, and it's complicated and it's interrelated. So you have to give them credit for trying, and understand that it always isn't a simple, straightforward path to the truth. And then when you find the truth, sometimes to remedy it, it's going to be very expensive. And by the way, this just popped into my head. My eldest daughter for a few years lived in Laguna Beach, which is, let me think, Laguna Beach, south of Los Angeles, I believe. 100 miles, something like that. Yeah, Laguna Beach is north of San Diego, but south of Los Angeles, right on the ocean. And because of their fires in the chapel, they hired what would you call? It was a goat herder, a small herd of goats, like 24 goats, and a tender, a shepherd to take care of the goats. And when I went to visit that summer, there they are up on the hill because the hills are right there at Laguna Beach, come down to the ocean, and the houses are built on terraces and then up the valleys that cut inland. And here were the goats outside of Laguna Beach, munching away, eating up all that brush and grass and weed, whatever it is that's growing that if the fire started would create a real problem.
Right.
Oh, anyway, long live the goat.
Oh, here's Jordan.
Jordan's in. Hi, Jordan. Can you hear us?
He can't hear us.
Okay. He can't hear us?
No.
Why?
He's joining. Well, no, he's not there anymore. Oh. Okay. Now he can hear us.
We're trying to get to San Diego come in. Jordan, can you hear us? What's happening?
He unmuted himself.
He unmuted?
Yeah, so he should be able to hear us.
Okay.
We just can't hear him.
You can type us, right? We can't hear you again.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, now we can hear you.
Oh,
Sort
okay,
of.
good. For some reason it takes a minute.
Well,
But
he
you're
is
not-
3,000 miles away. Otherwise, we can use smoke signals. All righty. If we can hear you, we can back up. I already talked a bit about the fires, but that was part of your research. You want to present it?
Are you able to hear me now? Why?
I can't hear anything.
I'm not sure what the problem is. Hello?
So what's happening? Okay. If we feel free to break in at any time, but at this point we're moving on because we can't hear you. Alrighty. What time is it, by the way? Running out of time.
12. Yeah.
Okay, so zipping along because I want to talk about grow your own here in a few minutes. Results of all this crazy weather we've been having. And I'm sure you all experience this one way or the other, either personally or on the news. What used to be called 100-year storm, usually this is in terms of rainstorms for some reason, are happening like every 10 years now. So, and then we talked about the fires in Paradise. Just recently, Buffalo at Christmas time
Mhm.
experienced what they called a blizzard of the generation, which I think is still like 30 years. Is that what we call a generation
I think so.
these
yeah.
days? 30 years. Oh, speaking of generations, before I forget, well, remind me when we get to population.
Mhm.
You got that chart about the medium?
I didn't get a chart, but I wrote it down.
Wrote down. Okay. Okay. Then I don't know. Did I ask you to look up because I forget? I think it was in North Carolina a year ago or so. They had 1 year's worth of rain in one day.
Oh, wow.
So I think it was North Carolina. But we've had several of those kind of rain events in the past few years where a half a year's supply, like
Mhm.
11 inches in a day.
Yeah.
27 inches. That was, I forget where that was. 27 inches in a day.
And in California last month, it rained 7.5 inches
Uh-huh.
in a month, and that's usually what they receive. It's twice what they receive
In a year.
in the month of January.
Oh, in the month of January.
Yeah.
And I had heard some of those Northern California and up into Oregon and Washington received basically a year's worth in a week. So things are changing. The other thing, being a farmer, well, no, being a gardener, I'm very aware that our agricultural and then the wild, let's say trees, are moving north. They can't do it as rapidly as animals and insects can, but they are shifting north. And this is another story to tell. By and large, America has become the power it is in the world because when we came here and stole it all from the natives, we became, because of the breadbasket of the Midwest, one of the most powerful country eventually in the world because of that, because of the soil and the climate in our Midwest. Back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, almost all countries were based on agriculture. And it wasn't until the late 1800s that industry really began to usurp that position in the world. But we had a wonderful base to take off from. Now, how many years ago? Let's say 20 years ago, my friend John and I decided we would drive the Alaska Highway. I think it was it the 50th anniversary? It was built during the Second World War. And I'd always wanted to do it. And I thought, better do it now. Or you're never going to do it. So we did it. And I remember driving north of Lake Superior on the Trans-Canada Highway, which was only 2 lanes. It's like, really? You just assume when you listen to the radio, the Trans-Canada Highway, like Interstate 80, 40, it's going to be 4 lanes. No, 2 lanes. And it was traversing what is known as the Canadian Shield, if you're a geologist, a very ancient 2 billion at least year old bedrock, very close to the surface. And for 150 miles north of Lake Superior, you drove through the boreal forest over the Canadian Shield. Probably at least a fourth of the land was lakes, shallow lakes, and the spruce, mostly forests, probably not more than 10, 12 feet high, wrist thick, and 100 years old. So as climate changes and our ability to grow our wheat and our corn and our soybeans shifts north out of the breadbasket with all that wonderful 10, 20, 30 feet deep topsoil, much of which we let blow away in the Depression, but that's another story. We're not going to farm the Canadian Shield. Right. It's just not agricultural land. So you have to take that into consideration. Oh, and the same thing is happening, let me think, latitude going north, altitude. If you have mountains, this is a good example. Japanese beetles. Do you remember when they showed up in your garden in Wellsville?
No.
Oh, lucky you. Lucky you. Well, I remember growing up on Long Island after the war, and one of my jobs as a kid, my mother loved her roses. And the Japanese beetles arrived in the late 40s on some lumber, I believe, from Japan, and had become the bane of gardeners in lots of places. We never had them here in Allegheny County until, once again, my memory, I don't know exactly. I'm going to say 15 years ago, a bit to the south of us, and I'm at 2,200 feet. Lower down in the valleys, 800 feet, they began showing up. And each year, they moved higher up the hills until eventually, about 10 or so years ago, they reached my garden. Not a lot, but they didn't used to be here. And the only reason they're here is because of global warming. And that's, I jokingly say, Sarah, is it? Have you ever heard of kudzu? No.
No.
I did.
Years ago, sort of a hippie Southern banjo band, as I recall, made a half-hour video called "The Vine That Ate the South." Oh, you got kudzu. There we go. Now you may laugh, guys. When I used to drive to Florida for craft shows, down 95, out of Washington, D.C., as soon as you hit Northern Virginia, any abandoned school bus, old farmhouse, a woodlot, the kudzu vine was taking over. Now I hear tell with global warming, it's already in southern PA. I don't know at what rate it's moving, but I haven't a hard enough time with my bindweed. I don't need kudzu.
We don't need more weeds.
We don't need kudzu. So these are all consequences of global warming. So what can we do? Turn my page here. A couple of things. What to do? Well, anybody that's known me for a long, long, long time, there are just too many people in the world. You know, I grew up in Long Island in Levittown after the Second World War, where during the war, most of Long Island was farming. A lot of potatoes were grown there, as I recall. And Levittown was being built there about 30 miles out from New York City, the edge of the suburbs, mainly or largely to house the veterans from the war, and all the new young families that were starting. You've heard about the baby boom that started in the late 40s, and they needed a little home on a little plot of land in the suburbs. And the first year we lived there, right behind our house was a potato field. The farmer actually used a donkey. I remember him going by with his straw hat with the donkey pulling the plow. Well, the next year that farm was sold, more houses built, and a mile a year out the island, 100 miles until now. Long Island is pretty much wall-to-wall suburbs. Population growth. I've always believed, 2 kids, replace you and your husband, and that would stabilize the population. So that needs to be thought about. Nobody talks about that when they talk about global warming. That reminds me of another story. I don't remember where the museum was. I think it might have been in Toronto. But they had this diorama from the Middle Ages, back when, what was it called? I'm going to forget. In the 800s to the 1200s, the economic situation in England, let's say, was based on a manor house in the country. And there was I'm going to say the Lord of the Manor, his wife, his kids. And they had this wonderful castle there in this diorama. And then they had a panel in the front that you pressed and a light came on. And there were 50 buttons for the 50 people that were needed to keep that palace running. From the cook and the cook's helper to the maid to the guy with the horses, da-da-da-da-da-da. 50 people for the Lord of the Manor. Now, if we continued with that view of life, and that one person in 50 could live like the Lord of the Manor, and everybody else slept on a straw mat and ate oatmeal, maybe we could have 10 billion people in the world. But that hasn't happened, as everybody knows. Everybody wants to live like the Lord of the Manor. And so that means not a straw mat on the floor in the stable or by the fire in the kitchen. No, everybody's got to have their own house, their own car, 2 cars. The earth is a finite place. We're already running out of certain materials that we need for our modern way of life. Maybe we can, like what's the word? The alchemist? No, who was it in the Middle Ages that was trying to make gold out of lead? Yeah, whoever they were. It starts with an A. Maybe we can do that. Don't know. But we seriously need to think about population control, whatever, however you want to look at it. The other thing is, we need to learn to conserve. I was rather shocked when I learned that the average American household is close to 2,000 square feet, whereas in England, it's somewhere between 700 and 800 square feet. And I remember that series from years ago, As Time Goes By. If you watch that, how little their kitchens and their living rooms were. So, can we all afford to live like the king in a 4,000 square foot mini mansion or whatever they're called these days? So it reminds me of another story that I read in high school. You know, you remember 2 or 3, and this one I've, for some reason, and it's an old Russian folktale. Maybe I've told this before. How much land does a man need? How much land does a man need? Well, it was one of those czars that was a good guy, and he decided his poor old serfs, so this would have been before 1860 or so, or 50, forget. They freed their serfs before we freed our slaves. Let's say 1840s. He decided that one day in spring, he would allow all his serfs to harness up their ox. I think they used oxen rather than horses. And as much land as he could plow around in one day, sunrise to sunset, he could have for his own. There was a very greedy, I'm going to say peasant, serf peasant, who thought, oh, wow, I've got a good, strong ox. I'm good and strong. I'm going to be all ready to go as soon as that sun comes up, and I'm going to plow around one strip as much land as I can. And he does. He, all day, 12 hours, I think, because it was around, springtime, 12 hour equinox. And he gets to the end. I forget how many hectares he went around. Sun setting. What happens? He drops dead of a heart attack. So all the land a man needs is about 6 feet by 1.5 by 1.5, 3 feet down. And for some reason, that story stuck with me. The third thing we can do is in this Shades of Jimmy Carter, who shines brighter and brighter as the years go by. Put on a sweater and turn down the thermostat. I was a potter for 30 years, and I know well it takes so many BTUs to get that electric kill up to within 100 degrees of the finishing. And it takes almost half that to get the next 100 degrees. So the same applies to your house. Even lowering the thermostat 5 degrees can save you a good 10%, maybe even 20% of your heating bill, whether it's wood or electric or gas. So turn the thermostat down, put on a sweater. And poor, are you freezing yet? When I come in to do this, they have a heater over here that makes so much noise with the fan, you can't hear the program. So they have to turn the heat off, and gradually, this building is not well insulated, is it?
No.
Gradually, fairly quickly, the room becomes quite cool. Okay. 2 more things. Eat local. And this is going to flow into my ending talk about what's coming up, Grow Your Own, where we're going to do another spring, summer, fall program on growing your vegetables in your own backyard. And finally,
and that starts next week.
Yeah,
or not next week.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And did you find an ostrich?
I did not. I did not.
She did not find. We all know what ostriches look like,
Yeah.
right? However, I'm thinking this is a myth that's not true. Do ostriches really stick their head in the sand?
I don't think so.
All right.
I
However,
don't know where that came from though.
I don't. Well, okay, guys, research it. Where did the poor ostrich get stuck with the idea that when danger approached, it just stuck its head in the sand? So, well, it's like your kid who's afraid of the dark, right? The boogeyman's going to get him, and they don't want the light off, so they just put the pillow over their head.
Yeah.
Okay. So my last comment about what we can do is vote all those ostriches out of office who do not see the truth. We went there a few weeks ago, so I won't repeat it. All right. Terrible. You know, if a Swedish girl, she was a girl at 15, now she's a young woman, can get out there and try and do something. We can all do a little something. And that's not going to save the day because it's a big problem and we need our big institutions to deal with it. But at least we are doing something. So get the book and read it, guys. You know, if you're old enough like me, why should I care? I'm going to be dead before this all happens. But I have grandchildren, and maybe they're going to have children, and they're all going to be living with the consequences. Alrighty, on a more cheerful note, Grow Your Own will run from March through November, I decided this year. Global warming is going further and further, so it's like the fire. From March to November, starting on the 10th in 2 weeks, and then on the 24th. And it will be on Fridays from 11:30 to 12:30 live. Or you can tune in through YouTube anytime. Maybe it'll be there for the next million years, who knows? Box of Books Library webpage, and then down to the events section to find out what the topics will be. And then the YouTube for any recordings. I'm calling it, and what am I calling it? Grow Your Own GYO Part 2 or 102. And that means it's still going to be great for beginning gardeners who don't know very much at all, or maybe know all the wrong things. And for old timers as well. And I'll just give an example. I'm an old time gardener. Guess what I just discovered, Melanie? By reading, I'm going to bring the other book in next week, 2 weeks, The Vegetable Detective. What a great, funny read. Anyway, guess what I learned? For 50 years, I've had 3 different asparagus beds, and every autumn, it used to be at the end of September, now it's the end of October, the fronds 4 or 5 feet high all turn yellow. I cut them down, and where did I put them, Melanie? Where did you put all your stuff from the garden at the end of the year?
Like in a compost heap.
On the compost heap. Guess what I just learned? The asparagus beetle lives in the stalks of the asparagus ferns.
Really?
So all I'm doing is giving them a home for the winter so that next spring it can come out. So what this English gardener did, he had a tradition. Now, where he was in England was even warmer than us, even years ago. So for him, it was a Christmas Eve tradition. He would cut his asparagus down, pile it in the garden, and burn it up.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm going to do that from now on.
Right.
Righty. So in March, I'm getting an article out in the paper and on the web page here soon, but I decided we'd start talking about siting your garden. In other words, where do you put it? What do you have to look for? Unless you're growing rice, you're obviously not going to plant it in your pond, right? I mean, that's obvious. But there are lots of subtleties about choosing a site. If you have a choice, or if you're stuck with the garden where it is, I have several friends like that, what can you do to make it better? And then the second time, which I think is such a fun topic, is what to grow. And the poor old beets, I always pick on the beets. When my kids were little and I had a huge garden, beets were one of the things I grew. Now, I don't remember, but I'm assuming at least one of the kids liked them. I didn't like beets, but I grew them. After the kids were gone, for years, I grew beets. It's like, Tradition. Who was it? Tevia singing Tradition in The Fiddler on the Roof. For years I grew beets, even though I didn't really like to eat them. I often gave them away. One year I had an epiphany. Why am I growing these beets? It's just me now. I'm not growing them anymore. And I haven't until my daughter moved back, and now she shares a small section of my garden, and she grows beets because she loves them. Anyway, so then I think Melanie really got excited about this. I decided to add one recipe every week related to what's coming along in the garden. And so the first one's going to be chives. What are they? How do you grow them? How do you eat them? And I thought also then I would also, besides the general topic, focus on a particular crop, maybe 15 minutes on. And once again, in the season. So probably one of the first ones will be either spinach and or peas, because they're the ones you plant first. So it'll be a general topic, a particular crop, and a recipe. So I want to say Sally. Sarah? Is it Sarah or Sally?
Sarah.
Sarah, do you have any questions since you're here live?
No, I don't think so.
Can't hear you.
I don't know what's going on.
We're having trouble too with people not being heard. So maybe it was us rather than Jordan. Well, I used to know sign language, but I've forgotten it. So
She shook her head no.
yeah. Okay. Well, maybe if you're interested in the gardening part, I have no idea. You can tune in 2 weeks. Otherwise, enjoy your work in Salamanca.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.